The Cabin Door. Written by Renee Richardson. Narrated by Red Bad Andy. 72-year-old Frank Cross lived in a minuscule 900-square-foot cabin in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. The shit shack, as designated by his son Matthew, sat on a forested acre that attached via a river to a national forest. He had a small tool shed next to the carport and the skeleton of a greenhouse that he never finished putting together. His wife Stella and he had bought the property as a vacation getaway of sorts, to escape from the hustle and bustle for the weekends, to fish, hike, roast marshmallows, and the like. Stella had even planned on getting animals one day, like goats and ducks. Frank wasn't too keen on the idea himself, thinking they'd just be a snack for a mountain lion or black bear. But in the end, he would have done anything Stella asked him to. His Stella had passed 12 years ago from a brain tumor that ravaged her mind and left her dead 2 months after her initial diagnosis. She was the planner, the dreamer. She wanted to make this cabin a fun summer stay for the grandkids. She talked about teaching them archery and beekeeping. Never mind the fact that they didn't know one lick about either of those things. They would figure it out, she always said with a happy shrug. After the funeral, Frank decided to sell their house and move to the cabin full time. It's quiet and out of the way, which suits him just fine. Despite his son's concerns about him being out there all alone, he wasn't really by himself. There was a jacked-up tomcat who patrolled the woods outside of the house. Frank took it upon himself to feed the rascal since he kept the rodents at bay. The cat had one crinkle ear and several extra toes on his giant feet, almost like he was collecting them for good luck. He was a brown and white tabby whose girth almost matched his length. Normally Frank wasn't overly fond of cats, but he appreciated the authority this particular cat possessed. Frank thought it presumptuous to give him a name, so he called him Cat. Cat never came inside the cabin, even to get out of the rain, which is a common occurrence on this side of the Cascades. He seemed to prefer the freedom of the woods and trails surrounding the property. When they first bought the place, he and Stella had explored their land. He would say he knew it pretty well. He didn't go beyond the river, however, because there was no sense in getting lost out there. The cabin didn't have cable, but Matthew was able to get internet set up through some rural program or another. Frank's granddaughter, Macy, had shown him how to look up videos on YouTube so he could watch old westerns whenever he wanted. He also watched his grandson Noah's videos. He played video games with his friends. Frank liked to leave comments on the clips for encouragement, even though he had no idea what was going on, and there was a lot more profanity than he would like. So things were what they were for Frank Cross. He would spend holidays at Matthew's wife and high school sweetheart's house, but other than the occasional trip to town for provisions or a doctor's appointment, he spent most of his time in his little cabin in the woods. It always got darker in the woods faster than anywhere else. He liked to be inside no later than 5 p.m. He lived in Oregon his entire life, and he learned to respect the forest. People around here knew somebody who saw Sasquatch on their fishing trip, or heard it tearing up a deer at night while they were shaking in their tents. Frank knew that was foolishness, but better safe than sorry. It was currently creeping on to 5 o'clock, so Frank hurried out to bring Cat some leftover chicken salad Beth had made for him on their last visit. He stepped out on the porch and looked towards the tree line. He clicked his tongue, letting Cat know supper was ready. After a couple minutes, Frank noticed some movement in the underbrush. Out saunters Cat, cool as a cucumber. He reaches Frank's porch and with a flick of his ragged tail starts wolfing down the meal. Frank chuckles at Cat's voracious appetite and swipes his hand along his furry spine. Cat doesn't stop eating, but he does start guttural purring as a thank you. Frank tells Cat that the weather is supposed to turn nasty tonight, so he better find somewhere to hunker down. He opens his front door and leaves it cracked for a moment to see if he can entice Cat to join him in the house. Cat just sits down and starts washing his face with one massive paw. Suit yourself, thinks Frank, and he shuts and bolts the door. He grabs a Diet Coke from the fridge and sits down on the dingy brown sofa. He used to drink regular until Stella made him switch, saying he was going to get as big as a blimp drinking so many sodas in a day. Frank picks up the World War II book he reserved from the library and settles in. He must have fallen asleep because he's woken up by a cell phone ringing beside him. He hated the stupid thing, but Matthew insisted he have it, living all the way out here by himself and all. He fumbles with the phone before answering it with a frustrated, "Hello?" "Hey, Dad. It's Beth." Frank has always thought it was sweet that she called him Dad. He and Stella had always wanted more kids, but it wasn't meant to be. Stella got pregnant with Matthew later on in life, after years of trying to fill her house with a pitter-patter of little feet. Stella called Matthew their miracle boy, and Beth was like the daughter they never had. I just wanted to check in and see how you're getting on. There's supposed to be a pretty nasty windstorm tonight, so you may lose power, Beth said in a nervous tone. I saw that. I've got lots of candles if that happens. And there's nothing in the fridge to spoil, so I'll be all right. Frank tries to reassure her. Okay, don't forget to charge your phone in case you need to call us. Maddie was planning on bringing you some jam my mom made in the morning, assuming the roads are clear. I also wanted to see if you wanted to go to Noah's game on Saturday. She asked, knowing Frank would have to be on death's door to miss it. I'll be there, as long as I'm back by dinner time to feed Kat. Is Macy going? I found one of Stella's old necklaces and I wanted to give it to her. Macy was 17 and usually uninterested in her 14-year-old brother's games. I don't think so, but I can pass it along. Well, anyway, I'll let you go, but let us know if you need anything. She hung up after a quick goodbye. Frank could hear a ruckus in the background, and he assumed it was the kids getting into it for some reason. Frank rubbed his eyes and stood up from the couch. He looked at the clock, and it was now a little after 8. It had started raining in heavy sheets outside. He thought of Kat and hoped he had found a cozy spot to wait out the weather. The wind was starting to pick up, too. He could hear it whipping through the trees. He was confident that there weren't trees close enough to the cabin to fall on it, but the wind this strong still made him nervous. He looked around the small interior of his home. The main room was the living room with a kitchenette. There was a small sleeper sofa, Stella's old rocking chair, and a wood-burning stove that was more than adequate at keeping the cabin warm. Stella's watercolors covered so much of the walls it was difficult to determine what color the walls actually were. He saved every one she painted and brought them from the big house so he could surround himself with the beautiful pictures. She would have thought it was silly while smiling to herself at this sentimentality. The kitchenette had a toaster oven, microwave, and 2 burner stoves, which was all Frank really needed. Toward the back was a tiny bathroom with a pedestal sink and stand-up shower. Past that there was the bedroom. Stella had painted that room a soft sage green. The bedding was dusty rose print with yellow sheets, the color of duckling down. Frank had hung their wedding photo over the bed. Across the dresser were pictures of Matthew, Beth, and the kids. He grabbed some candles out of the closet and placed them around the cabin. The matches were in the junk drawer in the kitchenette. He placed them where he could find them easily, made sure all the windows were closed and that the door was bolted and the chain lock was in place. His hunting rifle was hung up by the door, loaded in case of emergency. Just when he was going to make some tea, he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from outside. Immediately, Frank unbolted the door and threw it open. Cat flew past him so quickly Frank barely had time to register it was him, not a raccoon or something. This was shock enough, but above the din of the rain and the wind, Frank heard heavy footsteps making their way up to his front door. It was pitch black out there, but the light was coming from inside should have been enough to see someone coming up the path. But there was no one there. The heavy footsteps were quick and steady, crunching the gravel and shaking the ground with each thunderous stomp. Frank's blood ran cold. The invisible entity was making its way towards him and Kat. He didn't wait to see what it could be. He slammed the door and fumbled with the locks until it was secured. There was a single monstrous pound on the door that shook the cabin on its foundation. Breathing heavily with cold sweat beading across his forehead, Frank grabbed the rifle from the wall. He stood perfectly still and strained to hear what was going on outside with whatever the hell it was. All he could hear was the rain and the wind. After a few minutes, his breath started to normalize. He told himself that it must have been a bear or something, and the rain made it difficult to see. The lights in the cabin flickered and then went out. Frank swore and reached for the matches. He lit one candle and he used it to light the rest. When he got to the bedroom, he bent down and saw a cat hiding under the bed. It's okay now. You're safe in here. Let me get the fire going, and we'll get all nice and cozy while we wait for this to blow over. I don't know what that was, but it seems to be gone now. Frank loaded the stove with a couple of logs and kindling and got the fire started. He closed the grate, and the soft glow from the candles and stove helped him relax a bit after that scare. Right as he stood up to grab water from a dish for Kat, he heard a soft tapping on the small kitchen window above the sink. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. None but the windows, except the bathroom, had curtains. Not much need for privacy out here, but with the inky blackness outside, he would see who was making the sound. Hello? Is someone out there? He waited for a response, but there was nothing, except a tapping and pauses. He figured the wind must have blown a branch against the house until he heard a voice that seemed to whisper into his own head. "Francis, open the door. It's cold out here, and your father will be cross if his boots get soggy." His mother? Impossible. His mother died 30 years ago, and his father had been rotting in hell for 40-plus years. Nonetheless, Frank heard his mother's voice, more breathy than he remembered, and slightly pained. His hands itched to open the door, but this wasn't right. He was hearing things with this crazy wind. "Go away," Frank shouted at the wind. The voice of his mother faded away, and he was left with the incessant wind and rain. He would hear the heavy branches breaking off the trees in the distance, and the rain hitting the roof sounded like pebbles. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He wanted to go check on Kat. Besides, he felt too exposed in the living room. Kat was still hiding under the bed, his hulking frame trying to squeeze itself as small as possible. Frank tried his best to reassure Kat, but something felt wrong. Frank was starting to believe there was something outside, and it didn't have good intentions. As if to match his thoughts, he heard a rapid knock on the front door. "Frankie boy, you had better open this goddamn door before I cave your head in." Instinctively, Frank flinched at the sound of his father's voice. What the hell was going on? He knew his father was dead. He watched the coffin get lowered into his grave as he held his mother on her arm. No one shed a tear that day. Good riddance to bad rubbish, but he knew his father was dead. So why was that pounding on Frank's door in the middle of the storm? "Frankie, if you don't open this door, you'll be sorry." Frankie's whole body trembled. He squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears with his hands. He felt like a terrified 6-year-old again, hiding from his father's rages. He whispered to himself that this wasn't real. After a few minutes of rocking back and forth, he didn't hear another bellow from his father or whatever was impersonating him. Frank wanted to crawl under the bed and hide next to Kat and wait for morning. But there's no way he'd be able to get back up, so he opted to do something productive. He grabbed his toolbox from the bedroom closet and went to the living room. He started removing books from the bookcase, then pulled the boards apart one by one. One of the bookcases was dismantled. He set about hammering the boards across each window. He didn't want to board up his only exit, so instead he pushed the sofa in front of the door as an extra layer of protection. He started to feel a bit better. He briefly considered calling Matthew, but he didn't want him to drive out here in a storm like this, or to face whatever it was out there. So instead he grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the top of the fridge and went back to the bedroom to wait for daylight. He took a few pulls straight from the bottle when he heard crying coming from outside the window. It was faint, but Frank could swear he recognized it as Stella, just like she sounded when the doctor had told her she had cancer. "Frank, it's cold out here. Won't you let me in so I can sit by the fire? Please, Frank, it's dark and I don't want to be alone." Frank's heart shattered into a million pieces. He stood up as fast as his bones would allow and ran to the front door, pulled the couch away, unlatched the lock, and flung the door open. "Stella, are you there, honey? I'm coming." Frank ran outside and towards the side of the house the bedroom was on. The rain was coming down so heavy he could barely see an inch in front of his face. The wind chilled him to his marrow, but he didn't care. He needed to find his Stella. All of a sudden, Frank felt a tear in his shoulder and was lifted off the ground. He screamed as he had never done before. He could feel long talons ripping his flesh and shoulder meat apart. It felt like fire. He was thrown to the ground, and he tried to crawl away from his assailant. He realized that he couldn't see anything. It was dark, yes, but there was no sign of his attacker. He could hear ragged breathing coming from his left just a couple feet away. He struggled to his feet when he felt the ground quake near him, and the breathing got louder. He could smell something rotten, and he knew the entity, or whatever it was near. He jumped back right as another swipe of invisible claws ripped across his stomach. In this moment, Frank understood what was going on. He was going to die. That he was going to be torn apart by this invisible beast and left as carrion for the birds. He felt sorry for leaving Matthew like this. He would blame himself. He would miss his grandson's game and his granddaughter's upcoming graduation. He felt sorry for Kat, hiding terrified under the bed. Frank braced for another attack when he heard a roar so loud it took his breath away. He looked up and saw Kat clawing and hissing at the giant shadow. He clung onto the beast with all his might, raking his claws and kicking with his back legs and tearing with his teeth. Frank took the opportunity to run to the house. He felt faint with the loss of blood. He grabbed the gun sitting in the entryway. He felt stupid for not grabbing it in the first place. He ran back toward the shadow and Cat as fast as his broken body would allow him. He saw Cat flying through the air and landing in a heap by the carport. Frank raised his gun and shot the shadow as it shifted closer to him. The blast of the gun couldn't compare to the wail of the beast. He shot again. Another deafening cry greeted his ears. He fired his last round, and this time it was met with an angry groan. Frank could hear a giant bulk dragging across the drive and back into the tree line. Frank dropped the gun and fell to his knees. The pain in his shoulder was blinding. He knew he was too exposed out here, but he didn't think he had the strength to move. Then he heard a pitiful meow coming from Cat, and he willed himself up. He hobbled over to Cat and gently lifted him up, and he brought his face to Cat's fur and hugged him close. He somehow made it back inside, and he shut and locked the door, then gently laid Cat on the sofa. With the last of his strength, he called his son. He's not entirely sure what he said before he lost consciousness. He woke up in the hospital with Matthew and Beth sitting next to his bed. Macy and Noah were watching the little TV set up in the corner. Matthew and Beth were whispering in worried tones, trying not to wake him. They were discussing what they should say to convince Frank to move in with them. Frank could have told them not to bother. He would happily move in with them after that nightmare in the woods. His throat was dry, but he croaked out a question about the status of Cat. Matthew jumped up and grabbed his father's hand. He told him that Cat wouldn't leave his side. When Matthew tried to get Frank into the car, after taking Frank to the ER, Beth took the Cat to the emergency vet, and Frank smiled at the thoughtfulness of his daughter-in-law. They bombarded him with questions about what had happened, but he just shook his head, not ready to discuss what he didn't actually fully understand himself. Frank looked at his son and said, "I'll move in with you if I can bring Cat and never have to go back to the woods again."